So the Baltics are building the Maginot Line 2.0 to stop a future Russian invasion. And based off of what we've seen in Ukraine, it's kind of a good idea. So let's get into this. Now, earlier today, The Telegraph published an article titled, quote, "The Baltics are building a defensive line against Russia. Can they do it fast enough?" And of course, that article and other sources will be linked in the description below. But diving in, they say, quote, "Some 1,000 concrete bunkers with trenches, anti-tank ditches, ammunition depots, and supply shelters are part of a joint plan to fortify 600 miles of the Baltic states' eastern borders. But the 10-year project to shore up defenses against Russia may come too late, according to officials in the region. They fear a peace deal in Ukraine could rapidly turn Moscow's attention to the most exposed part of NATO's eastern flank." Gabrielis Landesberg, my apologies in the pronunciation there, who served as Lithuania's foreign minister until November, said, quote, "Putin is not going to let us wait those 10 years. The most dangerous time for the Baltics will be immediately after a ceasefire in Ukraine." And this is something that Russia has talked about. This isn't new. Now, we often view those as threats and empty threats at times because we see how stifled the Russian military has been trying to move even through portions of eastern Ukraine. So how on earth would they then expand across the entirety of that country and push into somewhere like Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia? But it is something Russia talks about. And with a enduring peace of sorts in Ukraine, whatever that might look like, there is a real concern. And you have to understand it from their perspective. If I'm Estonia, I'm definitely concerned about any sort of Russian aggression, just based off of the size discrepancy, not just in the population, but in military capabilities as well, with or without NATO. Now, moving on, they say the Kremlin has already laid out plans to increase military production and redeploy troops to NATO's northeastern frontier if Trump is able to broker a truce. To bolster their tripwire forces, the Baltic states, Poland, and Finland announced recently that they would withdraw from an international treaty banning anti-personnel landmines. If I'm not mistaken, Finland just signed on to this a couple days ago. The Baltic states, probably 3 or 4 weeks ago. This is the Ottawa Treaty. The United States is not a signatory to that, neither is Russia, and we've, of course, seen anti-personnel mines used throughout the conflict. And they're pretty effective. They're nasty little things, and the argument for any sort of ban on landmines is not because they are gruesome or brutal in war or that they're not effective against soldiers. The issue is that they tend to linger on battlefields for a long time. You just look at the landmines that the United States dropped, the cluster munitions in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. We're still finding those. They're still killing people, innocent civilians today. That's the risk of anti-personnel landmines. And the way that the Baltic states are looking at this, understandably so, is they're saying, hey, Russia's going to use these. They are using these. There's no way we're going to voluntarily fight handcuffed in order to abide by some treaty that our adversary is not going to. Now, I understand it in this sense, but I also think we need to keep in mind kind of the precedent that this is setting going forward. That said, again, the United States is not a party to this treaty, so I don't know how we can necessarily criticize anybody for deciding to not be a part of what we are already not a part of. They say a recent Danish intelligence report stated that once the war stops or freezes in Ukraine, Russia will be able to rapidly rearm, regroup, and wage war on NATO. Now, hear me out here. They say it estimates that in 6 months, Moscow could, quote, fight a local war in a country bordering Russia. In 2 years, it will be ready for a regional war against several countries in the Baltic region. In 5, it will be able to fight a large-scale war in Europe without United States involvement. Again, I think this has been mischaracterized at times, the whole idea that Russia just wants to march across Europe. And you see this image of the Russian infantry in the Donbass right now and saying, how are they going to be able to do that? They aren't. Whenever this war comes to a close, Russia is going to have a period of time where they have to rearm and re-equip. They plan on doing so. And if they maintain this wartime economy that they're in right now, it's not crazy that they need to do that in order to keep people employed and to keep the economy from crashing. So according to this estimate, 6 months at the earliest. But at that point, Russia could realistically push off some sort of aggression to a country directly bordering Russia. They say currently the alliance deploys battalion-sized multinational forces on a rotational basis in each Baltic state to act as a tripwire defense strategy to deter Russia. The idea with the tripwire defense there is very similar to the troops we have in South Korea. I always thought this was crazy. Anybody that we had in South Korea, the whole idea there was not that you could stop an entire North Korean invasion of the South, but that the killing of American soldiers there would automatically trigger a broader U.S. involvement or international involvement. That's kind of the approach that NATO has taken. There's a huge border for NATO to defend. right? We cannot stand up a robust defense across the entire NATO border. So what's largely been relied upon is this tripwire type idea. They say, but Tallinn, Riga, and Vilnius, who fear a lightning invasion, want more. The tripwire battle groups are replaced with combat-ready brigades and a permanent NATO presence. Put simply, the goal of the new defensive line is to prevent Baltic cities and towns from suffering the same fate as those razed to the ground in Ukraine. And I think that's worth keeping in mind, and I'm sure everybody is, as we're going through this, what we're actually seeing play out in the war today. So if you look at some of those frontline territories, I mean, Russia moved in and quickly occupied a lot of territory. So call it tripwire or not, like even if Ukraine had been in NATO, Russia was still going to be able to take those first 10, 20, 50 kilometers in certain regions. Or maybe it wasn't up to 50 in certain areas, but nonetheless, you get the point. The tripwire couldn't get there fast enough. So what the Baltics are looking at right now is, hey, we don't want to fight over the ruins of, in Ukraine, Bakhmut or Avdiivka or Marinka. We'd rather stop the Russians before that even takes place. They say Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania will each spend around 60 million pounds, a huge chunk of their defense budget, which relative to GDP are the highest in Europe after Poland. Mr. Landsbergis, again, the former Lithuanian defense minister, said the message received from NATO was, quote, how much are you doing yourself before you ask for our help? When will you start digging trenches and mining your border? It's a valid question. And he says, we're there now. We are sending a message. I hope that we use every minute that the Ukrainians are giving us in order to prepare. And this is one of the criticisms from people in the United States about NATO. Looking at, this is a great example, actually, looking at the Baltic states and saying, well, hold on, are we really going to go to nuclear war over Estonia, this small Baltic country? They're a great ally of ours, no doubt. But is that going to be the trigger? And people use that in the Donbass as well. And they said, hold on. Donetsk, Luhansk, like these villages in eastern Ukraine, is that something that we want to go to nuclear war with Russia over? And I think all of NATO is seeing that as well and recognizing, and Russia, for what it's worth, seeing that mentality here in the United States. Whether you think that hard tripwire there is good or bad, Russia no doubt sees that there's some hesitation. We might not be invoking Article 5, or the country might invoke it, but the 32 countries might not agree upon it. NATO might not go to war if a NATO nation is invaded. For all the big talk of NATO, and I do still think NATO serves a great purpose and hope it endures, but if you're Russia, you have to look at that and wonder if there's not some cracks in the armor. They cite Raymond Kaljulaid, again, my apologies in the pronunciation here, the head of Estonia's delegation to NATO. They're pointing out how quickly Russia hardened its defensive positions, making counterattacks nearly impossible without a huge loss of life. He says, quote, it proves that war is not really about cyber robots and drones. You need physical barriers, infrastructure on the ground. In the event of an invasion, we will be able to fortify and man the line in a much faster manner. At one part of stage one, Latvia and Lithuania have already installed fields of concrete pyramids, dragon's teeth, to obstruct armored vehicles. In Estonia, reinforced bunkers, which could withstand direct artillery strikes, have been tested and positions chosen. They're not yet in position, but they've got the equipment and they know where they're going to go. By autumn, they say the first stretch of what the military calls defensive strongpoints will be completed, according to the Estonia Center for Defense Investments. They say the country has also produced large quantities of different barrier wires, large 1.5 ton dragon's teeth, and 2 ton concrete Lego blocks, as well as T-wall roadblocks. Quote, this is the Estonian Defense Ministry saying, quote, this way the defense forces together with allies can halt the adversary from the very first meters. Again, I don't think we tend to do this. We swing in, we overextend in one direction or the other, right? And we say the war is all about cyber, drones, and air power. And then we look at what happened in Ukraine. And look, cyber, drones, and air power are certainly playing a big role. You could argue that that's the reason that the war is the way it is today. But I think the major takeaway is these fortified positions, how important it is to have those if you are thinking that an invasion is coming. The point that the head of Estonia's delegation to NATO there made was excellent, I think, talking about how it's not just a matter of your defensive positions, but the idea that you can quickly counterattack against Russia may not be valid. And we saw how quickly they were able to dig in and repel a pretty significant Ukrainian counterattack in the south. And Ukraine hardly gained any territory at a pretty significant loss of life. So other European nations are looking at that and saying, we can't afford Russia the opportunity to take any territory and dig in at all. Now, again, we should not at all downplay the effect of cyber warfare, electronic warfare, drones on the battlefield. My God, part of the challenge that offensive maneuver warfare is so hard right now is because drones are everywhere. They can see everything. So I don't mean that to downplay drones at all. Just I think it's easy to look past something simple like fortified positions, fortified lines, and say that's something of the past. It's not. It's being utilized every day in Ukraine. They say a key lesson from the high attrition warfare in Ukraine has been the importance of deep defenses and countering enemy mobility. Michael DeCiana, a research fellow at the Institute for World Politics, said, quote, maneuver warfare is not dead, but has become drastically harder. So unmovable fortifications take on new importance. They say, but it would be wrong to compare the Baltics' new defensive line to the Maginot Line, the solid defensive barriers built by France in the 1930s that failed to prevent a German invasion. Quote, it's not a wall or a solid line of fortifications. It's more flexible, modern, and mobile means of increasing defense and deterrence, said Marta Keppe, a senior defense analyst at the RAND think tank. Look, I did read this article before I opened with the whole this is Maginot Line 2.0 because I still think that's the best comparison. Even if I'm getting pushback here, and I felt like it was worth including from RAND, look, the Maginot Line in World War II, we'll try to throw up some pictures here to give you an idea. The whole idea there was stopping Germany from moving into France. And in retrospect, it kind of became like a little bit of a laughingstock. It's at times used as an example of trying to fight the last war. So the Maginot Line would have been very, very challenging to bypass under World War I conditions. But when you, with the lightning blitzkrieg war that the Germans introduced in World War II or used in World War II, along with air power, it did nothing. And the Maginot Line served no purpose in the opening days of the war. Ended up being something that the Allies had to fight over later in the war, oddly enough. But I actually still think that's a pretty good comparison here. It's serving the purpose right now. Whether these exact fortifications still serve the same purpose in 5, 10, 20 years is a different story. But as of today, I do think the Baltics are appropriately responding to lessons learned off the battlefield. So I'm sticking with Maginot Line 2.0, but I understand that's kind of a knock in a way. I don't mean it as such. They say the aim is to shape the invasion by channeling enemy forces into streams that can be attacked. Poland last year also began construction of its 1.9 billion pound East Shield, a vast line of layered defense infrastructure and high-end surveillance systems along its border with Russia and Belarus. This month, its military said plans were underway to start mining its eastern frontier. You're seeing this across the board. All of the Baltics, all of the eastern flank of NATO taking this Russia threat more and more seriously. Understandably so, all right? They say, quote, NATO is pivoting its posture of deterrence by punishment to deterrence by denial, by stopping the enemy at the border, said Mina Alandar, an associate fellow at Chatham House's Defense and Security Program. Quote, it's a race against time. Again, turning back to Mr. Kalajade, the head of Estonia's NATO delegation. One big question the Kremlin might ask is why give Europe the time to rearm, resupply, and organize their defense? We cannot discount the possibility that Russia will make a catastrophic miscalculation. And again, we need to step back and look at this with a historical lens. When you see an enemy building up, I mean, this was one of the arguments made during World War I, which is incredibly complex. We're not going down that rabbit hole here. But one of the arguments was as certain armies were gaining power and gaining strength, some sides thought, well, maybe now is the time to attack because we can't afford to wait until they get even stronger. So let's just get this out of the way now. And of course, that is not how things actually played out. And it was Germany looking at Russia and France, by the way. But you can see how that scenario plays out, where Russia looking at this says, we can't let the Baltics further fortify. We know right now they're spending a lot of their munitions and their money in Ukraine. Now is the time to strike. I don't know that there's any indications that that's on the radar, but the Estonian NATO delegation head here brings up a good point. It certainly is something that Russia is considering and we shouldn't discount entirely. But nonetheless, interesting article here from the Telegraph that I thought was worth running through. A lot of moves by the Baltics and our European NATO allies that make a lot of sense. Imagine this is only going to ramp up here in the coming weeks, months, and years. That's all I got for now. Thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.